Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
Another week has passed, and more tragedy in our state has occurred. Once again, we are focusing on our episode on the recent events occurring in our state. Today, we will discuss the tragic shooting death of Alex Pretti by a border control agent over the weekend. We will break down the reactions and fallout from the second shooting death during federal immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota. And we will get into the political realities we are seeing and those we have yet to see due to Operation Metro Surge, the deaths of Preddi and Good. The implications on Congress funding package awaiting action in the Senate and how we will potentially impact the 2026 election, both in Minnesota and nationally. We should note that precinct caucuses are next week, and we hope to return to regularly scheduled programming to cover the ever-evolving candidate pools, standings, and political chatter, as well as the drama that we sometimes love to discuss. Thank you for joining us again, and we hope you enjoy the show. So, an unfortunate start to yet another episode. We are going to cover the recent news of the shooting death that occurred over the weekend. Alex Pretti was killed on Saturday morning, and it was at 9:05 Saturday morning. He was a 37-year-old ICU nurse and a U.S. citizen. There was a situation and incident, and I'm sure pretty much everybody listening probably has seen the videos at this point, but it was pretty shocking, pretty hard to watch, pretty tough way to start the day and start the weekend. We know that we're going to break down some of the things that went on and that we heard afterwards, but the videos appears that he was directing traffic and recording what was going on with some ICE agents and border patrol agents that were on scene. There were two women. They were also there. They were approached by agents. One of them was pushed. Preddi is seen on video helping the individual up. They were sprayed with some irritant of some sort, and then he was pulled to the ground. There was a struggle between multiple agents, and he was shot. Reports afterwards correctly indicate that he did have a gun. He had a gun legally, and we'll get more into that later. And that was removed by one of the agents in the video showing appears before he was shot, and he was shot 10 times in 5 seconds. It's hard to, first, I guess I want to start by chatting a little bit through the differences of how this felt and asking your opinion. Do you think, was this different because it's the second one in 3 weeks? Was it different because it was different in the situation and the visuals seemed more clear? What's your take on how watching this video, the reaction, which we're going to chat through the administration reaction, but your initial kind of general feel from non-electeds, non-officials, just the general public in reaction to this incident?
I was notified about the shooting from a frequent guest of our podcast, Julius Hernandez, who lives in Minneapolis. He called me on the phone and was rightfully on his third sentence by the time as I picked up the phone, and he was telling me that there had been another shooting. It was bad. It was terrible. And he was accurately describing in the moment how the visuals, and I just want to pause for a second, and I think we're going to talk about and break down the shooting. I don't think either of us in any way are trying to diminish the shooting of Renee Good versus Alex Pretti in any type of way. The circumstances of them are different, but the outcome is the same, is that 2 Minnesotans have been killed by ICE agents, Border Patrol in the state of Minnesota, and we have discussed the concerns, how sad that is and traumatic for the state. But Julius was very passionately describing to me how this was different in the video. And I then turned on the TV set, looked at social media, and I was horrified. Horrified by what I saw, horrified by what was unfolding on the street. And it is, without again diminishing the light, without trying to say that, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that Renee Good deserved this or Alex Pretti didn't, or vice versa. I'm just saying the circumstances are different. And I think the fault and how people reacted to what occurred on camera that was recorded on video is what we're going to discuss today, I think more. And so I was horrified. I was just appalled. And so what was your response and when you first saw it?
Yeah, I mean, this to me, like you said, I just to echo and the blanket statement that I think can cover us in our statements throughout this episode are we are not diminishing the death and shooting death of Renee Good. Also tragic, different, and we're going to focus this episode on our conversations mainly on the second death, shooting death, with these operations going on in the state. It was really hard to watch, but important to. You know, we saw a couple different videos come out, and it, from me, very much appeared that this was he recording? Sure. Was he there, as a part of a protest? Possibly. Was he? But the visual that we saw is from, and again, this is my opinion of what I saw from the situation, was there was an interaction. A woman was pushed into the snow. He went over to check on her. They were sprayed when kind of their backs were turned. And then he was pulled to the ground and beaten slightly before he was shot to death. It is something I did not expect to see in the United States. It is, to me, not something I feel like the greatest country, the freest country in the world. Not what you expect to see from federal government agents. It was just really wild. And the actions and reactions were very swift. Yeah.
I think what you said was spot on. And as we've discussed, we've been, I think, really good about recognizing that independent of whether someone is an American citizen, they're here legally, you and I both want whatever immigration enforcement is done humanely. And that was not on display on Saturday morning. I will also say that I listened to every word that you said describing it. And I think that you have always shown in this podcast fidelity to the truth, being balanced, being accurate, being true to yourself. There will be people who will hear how you described the shooting and they will recoil and complain about it. I think you called it as accurately and as fairly as anyone could. But this is something that we're going to talk about, which is how people can look at things and draw different perspectives. But I was so interested in how you're going to describe it, and it was right down the middle, fair, accurate, balanced, and also knowing how you and I have discussed the humanity of this. What we both saw was a human being, and we wouldn't want that to happen to to anyone. And we've been so clear about that. So I appreciate you describing it in a measured, responsible, and factually accurate way.
I appreciate that. Before we move on, I do want to say, it is tough. I always make sure that we're trying to be objective in some of this, while also, of course, this is our podcast that we give our opinions on. And it was, this one, I feel it seems a little bit more, it just feels a little different in what the public is accepting. Of course, there are folks that are accepting the federal government's account of things, which I want to get into. But I think that there is a very large majority of folks that feel similar to, I think, how you and I perceived this incident. And of course, if you disagree, that is your right and option to do so. But we're going to talk about it how we see it. Moving into kind of the reactions and fallout of this, we saw, just similarly to the shooting death of Renee Good, a bunch of top-level statements came out really fast before a full investigation, and with some very, very questionable language. The administration's early messaging from Kristi Noem, from Bovino, from different members of the Trump administration, and different statements said, first, an initial post from DHS, Border Patrol, and the White House on Instagram had a graphic statement, and part of it said, an individual approached U.S. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, seen here. Of course, we've seen that picture. The officers attempted to disarm the suspect, but the armed suspect violently resisted. The suspect also had 2 magazines and no idea. ID. This looks like a situation where an individual wanted to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. Again, we've seen the videos. This does not appear, again, from my perspective, at all what we saw. It did not look, there is yet to be any video evidence I have seen of him brandishing his firearm, as we've heard, approaching them with his firearm, as they said, violently resisting. There was definitely a struggle on the ground that we have yet to see. This was, again, the initial reaction that some of it has been walked back, but they portrayed Preddi as an aggressor. They used domestic terrorism. They leaned into the fact that he was intending to massacre agents, and that blaming the fact that he brought a gun as a reason that you can't do that, and that's why he was killed. So the Second Amendment is definitely a big conversation to be had, but I was appalled. Again, I have a history of working in communications. I've spun like the best of us. When you spin, you have to have some semblance of facts on your side, or at least an inkling of something that people can get behind. I don't know if they feel emboldened because of how their reactions were to the Renee Good situation that were accepted by some groups of people very easily, but this just seemed off the reservation for me of what conceivably happened at the scene.
I would agree with you. This was one of the examples of a level of gaslighting that I have seen, I've never seen before. And it was, I know that term gets thrown around a lot, but it was really, it was offensive what the government was doing. And I want to just go back on something and just say is that this is something that you and I discussed in a previous episode with Julius and with John Rouleau, which is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I had come down on the side, and there's no wrong answer, I just want to portray your position accurately. I had come down on the side of that, and I think you were in agreement with me, but please tell me if I'm wrong, that because of some of the rhetoric that had come out in the immediate aftermath of Renee Good, the shooting of Renee Good, that I thought that in the best way to ensure transparency is because the way people at the top were discussing it, that a joint state and federal investigation was needed to ensure transparency. I don't want to put you on the spot, but am I describing your position somewhat accurately too?
Yeah, I think that was one of the frustrations and a little bit of a battle Julius and I had, was that a lot of Republicans were just accepting what the federal government said. I think you and I were saying neither side should be making definitive statements. We need to know more and hear more, especially when it's so aggressive. Absolutely.
Correct. And so where I think what happened is that the government's, the Minnesota, the media, those who want to look at these situations fairly and realistically and accurately, I think a lot of people's antennas were up as to how the government would spin this, particularly after what they did after Renee Good. And so, but the government proceeded to try to describe him in a way that that simply was not accurate. Yes, there was a struggle. And when we talk more about the Second Amendment, I'll push back on more of the framing. But what you saw was the United States government trying to reframe and, in essence, recreate and falsify the circumstances by which this man was killed. And that should call into question the concern that the government has in that. Is it calls into question when they prosecute cases, when they're giving a message. I will also say that since we last recorded, one of the discussions that we had was about the church in Minnesota that there had been a disruption and protest in. Nikema Levy-Armstrong since we last recorded, had been arrested, and she had appeared that her arrest had been documented, and she appeared strong, defiant, just as you would expect Armstrong to be on when that arrest occurred. But what did the White House do? The White House put out a doctored photo of her crying, and that is a tragedy. And tragedy is the wrong word. That is appalling.
Mm.
It is absolutely appalling. One of the things that, on a very small scale, that I will dovetail into is I have long said that practical jokes and April Fool things and kind of things don't land on social media because of the fast pace of it. And so I'm not a big fan of April Fool's Day because it's for amateurs. The real jokesters and the pros don't need a designated day. They pull stuff when they want to. But it diminishes your brand. And when the White House, to be serious here a second, when the White House put out that doctored image of her being arrested, that cut into their credibility. A law enforcement investigation, the arrest of someone, the shooting, and what's going on in the state is not you're not going to meme your way to the hearts and minds of Minnesotans on this. And that may be good in some Slack channel, or it may be funny joke behind the scenes, but that is not the type of appropriate content that we need. And the government, I think, in the manner in which they distorted, lied, doctored a photo of Armstrong, I think hurt their own credibility, which is already frayed to begin with. And so questioning what they're doing is even more important.
It certainly is. And I think, we've talked a little bit about the broken trust, how we see everything at this. The Democrats, are against Trump and the administration. Republicans are against Fry and Walls. And what we've seen through things like that and through this framing is that fraying of the independents or the moderate Republicans.
Correct.
They're losing all of their credibility they even have amongst the folks who want to give them the benefit of the doubt and want to maybe give a pause before they diminish. This is just it's so hard. I mean, this feels like an SNL skit, right? Of something that you would see after, like, we watched this. Like, we have seen it from every angle. Like, tell me. And if you have different evidence, if you have something showing that he flashed his gun, that he approached them with that, with his firearm, that he did anything of that sort, we would see that by now. We would
Correct.
have seen that immediately from the federal government if that evidence from them existed. And we're 4 or 5 days later and we have not, which, I mean, again, all of those videos are there. Something would have come out, right? And so it was really, really a really rough time for the federal government. And we're going to chat a little bit through some of the evolution of their stances, their messaging, what we're seeing here. But first, I want to chat also about something that came out immediately after. Minnesota authorities requested scene access to conduct an investigation in coordination with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. They were initially refused access despite having a warrant. And we saw Ellison and the police department and others sharing statements, tweeting that they insisted that they're staying on scene, that they are not going to be pushed out. And now I know we've been talking a lot about the need for a joint investigation when it comes to Renee Good and working together on cooperation. But it certainly does not give a lot of confidence when you immediately say, back up, you're not here. You can't touch, you can't see, you can't be involved, you cannot witness what we are doing. It's sketchy.
Becky, we rarely make edits to our podcast aside from filler words, ums and ahs, and some spaces. But there was a little glitch in the audio when we recorded with Julius and John a few weeks ago. And I had made a point, which had kind of gotten lost a bit because we were talking over a bit about what happened after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, there was a fight in Parkland Hospital about who was going to take Kennedy's body. And there was a fight that ensued inside Parkland Hospital between local authorities and the Secret Service about how they were going to process, because the argument from the local police was that this was a murder, and the Secret Service wanted Kennedy out of there. They wanted Johnson out of there. And so there was a fight that ensued. And so I had made that historical reference about the bureaucratic conflict that can ensue in the aftermath of a shooting and a problem and an incident like this. And that played out in the aftermath of this. And respectfully, I think it's bullshit. I think that when the federal government is going to go out and distort the facts in criminal matters, if they're going to arrest anyone, legal, not here legally, Minnesotan, not a Minnesotan, and they're going to doctor photos of the arrest and to portray those people as crying or masquerade or distort the facts of those underlying thing, the questions need to be asked. It is the responsibility of the body politic to question their government. And that is something that is continually needed to be done not because independent of the government's action, that is the right of people to do. But the government, on the federal government, has supplied so much reason and basis for there to be questions not only about what they're saying, but what they're doing, because the facts do not match up with the rhetoric.
And that's something that I think I am definitely one of those individuals who, with the shooting of Renee Good, I did give a little bit more benefit of the doubt to the federal government and in taking over that case and thinking that they would do things properly. I am one of those people who have continued to fray off my trust in the handling of all of this. And I certainly think there needs to be a joint investigation into the shooting of Renee Good. I certainly think that there needs to be more cooperation. And I certainly think it is horrifying and sketchy and abhorrent that the federal government is thinking that they do not need any eyes, ears, and accountability when it comes to this. And so we are going to hear a whole lot more of these investigations as they move forward. But the initial reactions certainly were not well received from the what the Trump administration did and how they conducted themselves. We have since seen a little bit of a walk back from President Trump, from his commissioners, and a lot of that has to do with, again, not just the left or radicals or any protesters disagreeing or saying anything. There have been a decent amount of Republicans who have spoken out and urged a joint investigation. We'll chat a little bit about some local ones here shortly, but the tone has shifted because of these videos, because of the mass backlash, and we have seen different moves by the White House, maybe hoping to actually lower the temperature and change things going on. We know that the I'm having a hard time with this. Border Patrol Commander at Large Bovino was removed from his role, taken out of Minnesota, and the DHS also suspended his access to social media. He was tweeting against folks that were arguing with him. Representative Massey was one of them. Massey tweeted, "Carrying a firearm is not a death sentence. It's a constitutionally protected, God-given right. And if you don't understand this, you have no business in law enforcement or government." And the commander at large replied and said, "Attacking law enforcement is not a right like you want it to be." Again, trying to lean into the fact that this individual attacked law enforcement and therefore was maybe justified in being killed. So his social media access has been revoked, and they are trying to definitely move and shift the face of this Operation Metro Surge and ongoings here in Minnesota. Tom Homan, who is the border czar, is now in Minnesota. He met with Fry and Walz. Earlier this week, we saw some actual decent tweets from President Trump about his phone calls with Governor Walz and Mayor Fry, saying that that they went well, that he was optimistic, and that he was sending Homan here. Do you like this shift? Do you think this is, because I will say, for me, 2 days ago, I was having a tough time because I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. I didn't see that we were working our way out of this.
First of all, let me say this. I'm really proud of the discussions that we've had. I have the utmost belief, not to spin too much, that the United States senators and elected officials that have come out did so because we were ahead of the curve and we called for some of that. And I don't want to pat ourselves in the back too much, but I think that very quickly, I know that without getting into too much behind the scenes production, that the episode that you and I had with John and Julius had some rocky moments. But I think that we are going to look back at that episode as being a very defining moment in terms of the advocacy that John had and the advocacy that Julius had, and you and I, to some degree, falling in the middle in some ways. That is where I think where our position became is where the vast majority of people are on this. And so I think it's important that it grounded me in our conversations. And I think that shows that us continuing this exercise of having a podcast and talking really is contributing in some ways. And I'm tongue in cheek, but obviously they came to that on their own. I'm not being naive, but we were there. And so, yes, I always want to be honest on the podcast. I do have a concern that there could be some flare up points. I've changed a little bit that I don't know to what percentage I still believe that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I'm probably at 51-49. I went down last night with a neighbor to the scene of where Alex Pretti was killed, and it was an incredibly moving experience. My neighbor and I went down, and we were both surprised at how quiet it was. That I expected there to be more disruption, but it was, aside from a social media influencer, which we'll talk about my position on social media influencers later, dropping his camera and making some noise. It was incredibly quiet. It was almost, and you could tell that people understood the gravity of what occurred at this spot. And it was as quiet of a spot in Minneapolis that I've ever been a part of. And there was law enforcement around, but it was just, and we were there very briefly, but I wanted to go down and I wanted to see it and I wanted to experience it. And I think, and as he and I were discussing, and I said last night that I'm like, look, I have a real concern that this gets worse before it gets better. And I still pivot. This is a situation, Becky, where I think it's an hour by hour moment because, and we'll talk about this more when we go through some of the responses, what is really inflaming these situations, and I want to be as fair as I can here. There's still protests going on. There's still ICE border agents in Minnesota. There is still behavior which I think is outside of the bounds of what the First Amendment allows at some hotels and other things. On the flip side, we have Border Patrol and ICE agents who are mooning people outside hotel windows. And the other thing which we'll talk about is I worry about press conferences and rhetoric right now and what's appearing on social media. And I think that there is a conscious effort to dial down some of the rhetoric, but it is an hour by hour moment. And I think that's why I'm kind of pivoting between, I was very much like you. I think you're describing it different, but I was very much like, this is going to get worse before it gets better, which is another way of saying I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I'm going to take this hour by hour, day by day, and not try to prognosticate too much. But I'm a consummate optimist to a fault, and my hope is that this gets better.
To me, one thing that gave me a little iota of confidence that we are on that 51+% of moving towards some resolution was surprisingly that was the tone and the message in the tweet from the president or the post on Truth Social, because I would say prior to the death of Alex Pretti, it would have been Walz is an a-hole. He deserves everything he gets. He is a fraud. He is, all of these words, all of these horrific things. He said the conversation went well. They look forward to working together. I mean, it was very much a kind, gentle, something we more expect to see from our president of this great country. And similarly, when he posted about a conversation with the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey. So it was, which it's silly to think that a nicely worded, kind message can be something, but for me it indicates that he is looking a little bit inward and at these actions. He and his senior officials, I've read some articles of folks within the administration that are upset. Obviously they're hearing from some of these, we're going to chat about 2026 possible implications, and there are a lot of them. And I feel as though he must be seeing some of that writing on the wall and seeing that he does need to concede something at some point to be able to move forward forward and hopefully conserve some possibilities of Republicans not getting their butts beat in 2026. And the longer this continues, the more tragedies we see obviously erodes those chances. So try to hold that a little bit. I'm going to, at this point, be a little optimistic.
As you were describing this and talking about this, I wanted to ask you this. If you were managing this crisis, if you were managing and being a go-between, what would be your approach about what you would respectfully tell the president, tell Governor Wall? Like, if you're in the room, what would you be saying about what we should post on social media?
I mean, I think a unifying message that they did have a good conversation, that they are going to committed to working together. I would say that we are jointly going to turn down the rhetoric, and we are not going to be focused on the election at this time. We are going to focus on what is best for this great nation, and that is to ensure that no more deaths are had, and that violent criminals are taken off the street, that we conduct and end Operation Metro Surge and call it, federal government wants to call it a success, and we can return to business as usual. But I would, I think that they need to, almost like have a ceasefire here, right? That we, for the next week, it is not political. We are not talking politics. We are not talking about voters and the ballot. We are focused on how we can finish this situation that is at hand, leave the great state to the wonderful leaders of Minnesota, and move on.
I think you're right.
Again,
and it's
Pollyannish. Politics is everything. And that is 100% the reason why I feel like Trump made this decision and is turning a little bit. But do you have any wonderful thoughts of that?
I agree with you. I think you did a really good job of describing it as a ceasefire. It's apt, it's appropriate. I do believe there was a Becky in the room. I believe that there was someone like you in the room who said, now, gentlemen, we need to talk about how we message this because we need to tone this stuff. So I'd like to believe that was, but my sense is there was probably there was a Becky in the room who said, now let's talk about how we message on this. So, because they got on the same page very quickly.
And I will say, I know that we've talked before a little bit of like on the front end of this, before the death of Renee Good and Alex Pretti, a little bit of what both sides might have wanted going into this. They wanted a little bit of the protest. They wanted a little bit of the dirtiness. I think that both sides went in with some thoughts of how this mess can benefit their side. I think we've gotten so far beyond that I think both sides are looking for some solution and conclusion and time to move on.
I would agree with you completely. You said it very well.
I want to turn our attention to the conversation around the Second Amendment as it relates to this incident, to the thought of our federal government and some major officials, what we're hearing here on the ground. And I want you to help me out here again, because I think, I know you I think you've said on the show before, you have your concealed carry permit. You've gone through all of the trainings. This is something that you understand how this works a little bit better than I. So I'm going to chat through a little bit of this. And then we've had some great conversations. Brian Strasser, who is the chair of the Gun Owners Caucus here in the state. He has been very outspoken. Rob Dorr, who is the president, I believe, might be wrong on their titles, but both involved in this organization and are good stewards of educating me and being advisors on things, and I've gotten a lot of good insight from them. Starting off with the fact that we know that Alex Pretti did have a gun on him at this time. He is a lawful gun owner. He has a legal carry permit under Minnesota law. And initially, as we discussed, we heard from the administration essentially, and this is paraphrasing, but he had a gun, therefore what happened is on him. It's kind of like if you go to a protest with wearing a gun in a holster, you might get shot. That's just what what is possible. It is pretty in the face of what our Constitution stands for. And it's been a very interesting reactions from Republicans, from elected leaders, from both sides, right? We've seen Democrats that I never expected would be defending a Second Amendment, defending the Second Amendment, and we've seen some Republicans falling in line with what we're seeing from the administration and saying basically, he did have this, he was asking for it. Before we even go further, please chat with me your brain working through this messaging and what we've been seeing.
Sure. I have mentioned frequently on this podcast that I'm a First Amendment absolutist. What I don't discuss as much, but I have discussed, is my strong advocacy for the Second Amendment. When this shooting happened, I spoke to a number of people who said, he brought a gun. You can't do that. That's bad. And, why does he need these magazines? Why is he doing this? Why is he carrying a gun at a protest? And then it came out that he had a carry permit. And I just want to remind people that I don't see anything in the video that in any way, shape, or form justifies him being shot. I'm going to let the investigation unfold, but there is nothing that I have seen in the video that would justify in any way, shape, or form this man being shot. One statistic I want to note is that in the last year or so, the city of Minneapolis has successfully collected, confiscated in the course of law enforcement matters, 900 guns without incident. And it appears this situation, again, I'm not a law enforcement expert, not an agent of law enforcement, but I can see with my own eyes, this was handled in an incredibly inappropriate way. I had a number of conversations with people all throughout the day and made a couple points. In the interest of just full transparency, I carry a gun very regularly, and I carry extra magazines with me when I carry a gun. I explained to some of my family and walked them through a little bit about how the language that the White House was using and DHS was using was so potentially dangerous. There is never a time when I am walking around with a gun and extra magazines that I am planning for a mass casualty event. When I went to downtown Minneapolis last night, I had my gun with me. And I carry a handgun for a variety of reasons, but none of which I have to answer for because this is the United States of America, and I don't have to answer questions like that in the United States of America. I cannot begin to tell you how wrong many, many self-identified conservatives and Republicans were on what is and isn't allowed when carrying a handgun. He was a conceal and carry permit holder. He has every right to carry a handgun. He has a carry permit. Minnesota does not have a conceal and carry law. We have a carry law. He can openly carry. He could, but there is nothing that he did that I've seen so far that warranted him being shot. Yes, there was a scuffle. Yes, there was a physical confrontation that existed. And I'm going to leave it up to law enforcement and the investigators to determine who was at fault of that. But when the city of Minneapolis has statistics that show that they've had confrontation with people and they've been successfully able to remove the gun from the situation without shooting an individual, there's nothing that this man did that I've seen at all that justified him being shot and killed. I think in terms of the politics and coalition building, I am absolutely stunned by how few of Republicans and self-identified conservatives have either not read the Second Amendment, understand what it means, or understand the gravity of the coalition that is being frayed away and is being cleaved away from Republicans by their messaging on this. I have a Second Amendment right to carry a gun at a protest. And I was using some of the language that they said, and I was describing to people, I said, so when I carry a handgun and I walk towards you, am I advancing with you with a 9mm? When I carry extra magazines, am I prepping for a mass casualty event? I'm not. Everything that I have seen, what he had, what he was carrying, was well within what I would call the everyday carry of people who carry handguns. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of what else I carry, but there is nothing that I have seen to make me believe that anything he did that day justified him being being killed. Furthermore, I don't see any evidence that he brandished a firearm. And I am utterly stunned at how this administration has found a way to make Democrats more in line with the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and other aspects of the Constitution. But particularly, I had a number of conversations with people where I had to say, look, I may not have made the decision that he made in carrying it in that situation. That doesn't mean he didn't have a right. And I certainly put to bed with people the fact that he had magazines with him. That is incredibly common. It is incredibly common. And it made me realize how many conservatives, many self-identified conservatives and Republicans do not understand what everyday carry means, what that comprises, and how incredibly normal, justified, and legal what Alex Pretti was carrying that day was. The only thing I will say, in the state of Minnesota, you should carry your driver's license with you and photo ID and your license and your gun permit. I always carry that with me. He apparently did not, according to the initial reports, did not have his ID and his permit with him. That is just a matter where you have to show it, and then it's a low-level offense. I think it's a $25 fine, and then you got to show it to them. But I always carry my ID. And let me just point something to you. Him not having his gun permit is not a reason to shoot him. And again, I think that what we have seen is, in this entire situation, is exposed people's misunderstanding of what the First Amendment is on both sides. Okay? What's protected, what's not. But certainly, the most glaring situation that has happened is, and politically damaging for Republicans and conservatives, is the fact that so many, again, self-identified Republicans and conservatives have no concept of what the Second Amendment means and what the rights are.
Said all across the board. I saw our FBI director saying that you were not allowed to carry at a protest, which was very much refuted. There was a Fox News interview just in the last day or so from that President Trump said, and this is a quote, "I don't like the fact that he was carrying a gun that was fully loaded and he had 2 magazines with him. That's pretty unusual. Nobody knows when they saw that gun."
It's not. Yeah. What is the point of carrying a gun if it's not loaded? Fully loaded, with probably one in the chamber. Okay, yeah. Full magazine plus one in the chamber. There is not any day that I go out with my gun loaded, with extra magazines, and I'm planning for a mass casualty event, it is my intention to confront law enforcement officers. I carry where I legally can at an appropriate level, and to go out and describe what he was doing as anything other than a fully protected Second Amendment activity is not only disrespectful to Preddi, to the memory of this man, it also flies in the face of advocates of the Second Amendment, which, if people haven't realized, people who are Second Amendment people know what they're talking about. And
well, right.
And again, on this podcast, I've draped myself more in the First Amendment than the Second, but I'm going to take a little bit of editorial latitude for a few moments as we discuss this topic to make clear that I am equally with the Second Amendment.
Rob Dorr, again from the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, was on WCCO, and he said, quoted, this is a quote, he said, "You don't have to pick between exercising your First and Second Amendment rights." Correct. And that, to me, I think was just really straight, simple, how it goes. I also saw a tweet that said, if you get shot for carrying a gun, you don't have gun rights. If you get shot for legally observing and or protesting, you don't have freedom of expression and assembly rights. I am with you. I think the Constitution, this is... I might at some other time, not today, have another rant of sorts. For years when I was working in Republican politics, I would find myself laying in bed, trying to fall asleep, and type out notes and thoughts that came to my brain, for use in press releases or op-eds or something. And that hasn't happened for years. I haven't worked in Republican politics. I used to even wake up, sometimes in the middle of the night to something that I needed to write down. The last couple of days, it's been that way of different things that of my thoughts of how insane this is to me. And again, I say this as somebody who, my age of Republicans, this is what it was. It's the Constitution. It's your Bill of Rights. It is what you can and cannot do to protect yourself from. Dean Phillips, he tweeted this: "For years, I quietly mocked Second Amendment defenders who argued arms were necessary to defend American rights against a tyrannical government. Today, I apologize because I've seen it with my own eyes." I mean, it is mind-blowing, and not something I had on my card in general, but in 2026 of Republicans giving the middle finger to our Second Amendment or to the Constitution in general. And it is just blows my mind that this is where we are, and what I'm seeing from some folks on social media, some of our elected leaders supporting and defending this messaging or not standing up to it. And we'll chat more about what that's going to mean. I do want to move on here.
Just one point I want to make.
Yeah.
I just want to very quickly compliment Brian Strauss and Rob Dorr.
Yes.
For going out as they did. They staked a flag. They should be applauded for their consistency, their advocacy. Agree with them, disagree with them. They are principled, they are consistent, and in this day and age, that is something that should be complimented and rewarded. So I just wanted to make my point on that.
Thank you. I also want to kind of turn our attention to a few others that I would like to applaud. We've seen some great leadership, some great statements, letters, action from some of our elected leaders here in the state. I want to start with Senator Zach Duckworth. He wrote a letter urging federal officials to cooperate with state authorities in investigating the shooting. He tweeted his letter out earlier this week and said, "At this moment, it's critical that local, state, and federal officials work collaboratively to instill public trust and confidence in their conduct. They should partner on investigations, stay grounded in facts, exercise restraint, and ensure transparency to best serve the public." Senator Julia Coleman, who we have spoken with recently, also sent a letter to Trump, Walz, and Fry, tweeting, and she also tweeted, "Minnesota deserves better than a Trump versus Walz standoff. After tragic shootings and rising tensions, I'm calling on all sides to de-escalate, pause targeted operations, honor ICE detainers for criminals, negotiate, and prioritize peace. Leadership means working together." And then Representative Nolan West is another one. He has been doing some interviews and said, "It's clear that Operation Metro Surge is causing more harm than good. It puts law enforcement officers' lives at risk and feeds the chaos destroying our state." This is going to be something I think we really need to boil down of Republicans who are standing up for this, Republicans who are not, who are blindly loyalists to the Trump administration and what they are saying with some of this. And so I think there are a lot of potential implications. Obviously, only time will tell with the upcoming election. But I did just want to applaud these individuals, and there's some more I know as well, but these individuals in particular for being brave, being courageous, standing up, and being vocal about that things have gone too far, cooperation is needed, and potentially a pause in the Operation Metro Surge or complete stop, halt is necessary.
I think this is a good time for me just to say a point that I'll just expand on a little bit later when we discuss political realities. But you and I are Republicans, consider ourselves homeless Republicans, and we may be different percentages of Republicans. I think it's fair to say that the reason why we're highlighting the actions of Republicans, because in all honesty, you fairly discussed, and we don't keep a tally sheet to make sure every episode is fair, because that's not a way in which to run a podcast and do things. We call it as we see it. But you noted the commentary from Fry and from Walz and from the president. And there's been some obviously bad examples and good examples. Part of the reason why I think it's so important, because this is our podcast, that we could acknowledge the work of these Republicans, is that because you and I want Republicans to succeed. And so it's natural for us to highlight when Republicans are doing the things that you and I believe are good for Republicans to do. That doesn't mean that we don't have guests on who are more partisan, who have different views politically. And we certainly have a very long history of bringing on people that disagree with us. But in this particular instance, kudos to those Republicans for speaking up and being thoughtful. And the reason why we're highlighting them is because, to the degree which we are Republicans, we want to see Republicans succeed, and we want to compliment and highlight and give a shout out to good behavior, or good messaging, not good behavior. That sounds condescending, but Republicans being thoughtful.
Absolutely. Kind of shifting our conversation two political realities that are facing us. Starting with the current situation as we know it this month, this week in Congress, and then we'll get into the 2026 implications here shortly. But end of this month, end of January, there is a funding deadline. And prior to some of this action, it was, from what I was reading and gathering, understood that there was possibly some work that might have needed to be done, but it was generally thought of, from my gathering, and maybe I was naive in this, that the six-bill funding package would potentially be passed to avoid a government shutdown this Friday. The House is currently in recess, so any changes to this bill package would require action by the House. But right now, the Republicans in the Senate do need help from the Democrats to hit that 60 vote threshold required to advance funding package. From what we're gathering right now, it appears that's no longer going to be the case, because part of that is funding for DHS, which is where ICE is housed under. Senator Schumer has said that Democrats will not provide the votes to proceed to the appropriations bill if the DHS funding bill is included. They've made it clear that as it's currently written, their position is that the DHS bill fails to include meaningful oversight, accountability, and reforms for ICE and Border Patrol, especially in light of U.S. citizens being killed during a federal immigration operation. And they are demanding conditions such as mandatory body cameras, which we talked about last week, judicial warrants for arrest, limits on mask and militarized tactics, and an independent investigation into the conduct of immigration enforcement. So right now, what the conversation is that they want to strip out that DHS bill into out from that larger appropriation package that again is different parts of, an omnibus bill here that includes defense funding, education, health, etc. Again, the issue that we have is the deadline is the end of January. The House is currently in recess, so to change that, they would have to change it, pass it in the Senate. The House would then have to reconvene to pass it as well. And I think this goes.
You really nerded out there for.
I liked my time in Congress. This is a fun and a nice change of pace to actually talk about government for a little bit. But we also know that there are some of moderate Republicans that are having issues with this as well. So it certainly seems as though this week is going to be tough. There are some procedural votes that I believe are occurring as we're or today as we're recording this, and so things might change by the time we air this. But certainly, what goes on across the country and in states like Minnesota have implications on the national stage, and we're seeing that right now.
Correct. And in the aftermath of the George Floyd shooting, the killing of George Floyd, I should say, that there was a lot of discussion about defunding the police, reforming the police, reimagining the police. ICE is not, they're not law enforcement. They're not classified as the same way. And so I don't think there's any intellectual consistency that's needed. As they say, the foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind. And so I think that ICE funding, how their mission is defined and the scope of their mission and the training, the oversight, DHS is screaming for new leadership, more oversight, and much more transparency into their operations. And I think I'm going to be very interested to see how this plays out in terms of funding. In a normal way, no, not a normal way, but I think that in a normal political context, we would be discussing this as, and correct me if I'm wrong, so you're going to shut down government over enforcing immigration policy. And it's amazing, and we'll talk more about some of the polling related to this, but I think that, and it's not as the same as if you're shutting down government because you want to defund the police. It's not the same argument, but I got to tell you something. I think it's going to be a very centrist position and a reasonable position that the way in which ICE is operating and has operated in Minnesota, as I said, they're a government agency that is in desperate need of oversight, transparency, retooling, reframing, of their mission and their responsibilities. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And let's put a pin in that because I think it's something I want to talk about when I chat about the legislative messaging here in Minnesota when it comes to the legislative race and walls. But, polls are certainly showing a lack of support as well. We see Trump's overall approval rating sinking to 38%. It's the lowest level in his current term, has just recently dropped from 41%. Again, this is a Reuters poll that was conducted Friday through Sunday, obviously over a lot of wild
report card
time.
in high school. Oof.
Just 39% of Americans approve of the job Trump is doing on immigration, and that's down from 2 points just this month, which is a very fast drop. And then when we look at ICE going too far, 58% of poll respondents believe that ICE have gone too far, 12% say not far enough, and 26% say they were about right. 9 in 10 Democrats say they have gone too far. 2 in 10 Republicans say ICE agents have gone too far, but 6 in 10 independents say they have gone too far. And that is obviously going to have a big impact on what potentially goes on. Now,
yes.
When we look at this 2026 election, if you remember, it was just about a month ago when we were talking about fraud. Everybody was talking about fraud. It was everywhere. It played a role in Governor Walz no longer running for a third term. It has changed everything here in the state. And we are 3-4 weeks later, and it's barely a second of a newscast. It is barely part of anybody's conversation or topic or top of brain. So I think that as we look towards the 2026 election, I want to walk through this a little bit because, again, it's far away. Who knows really what's going to happen between now and then? Who knows if something is going to overshadow this situation that we're currently in? But as I sit right now, I think that there's going to be that this is going to play a role in how voters vote, and certainly give Democrats a leg up on things. That is a big shift from how I felt a month ago. There was a Star Tribune article that came out. I think you actually shared it with me. But our good friend Preya Samsundar was quoted in there. And, she's talked to us a lot about on the podcast as her family. She comes from a family of immigrants who came here legally. And she said a few things that I just want to share. She talks about how the narrative has completely shifted, where 2 months ago we were talking about billions of dollars in fraud in this state being a bad thing for taxpayers. We are now in the position of having to discuss whether or not individual American citizens were murdered by government agents. She talks about her own mother, who is a conservative and voted for Trump in the past, has become fearful of leaving her home without the passport and said that she never wants to vote in an election again. And it says, as someone that voted for Trump and championed GOP policies and candidates, Samsundar said it's heartbreaking for her to see her mother feared being pulled over merely because she's got a different skin color. If anybody's listened to us before and listened to a panel with Preya on it, she, has spent a decade plus working in this world, messaging on behalf of Republicans and our platform and our policies in the administration. And my heart breaks for her that her parents, her family has to go through this. I know it has to really wear on her as well. And she's not alone. I mean, we know that this is the case for many that come from immigrant families legally, obviously some individuals just across the political spectrum, myself as well. So before we move on to chat a little bit more about this, just a simple question here. Do you think fraud is going to come back and become still a top issue for voters? Does ICE and these shooting deaths of Good and Preddi reign supreme? Or do we just simply have to wait and see if a third horrific something eclipses it all?
The answer is I don't know. Let me say this, is that piggybacking on previous episodes, the point I had made about fraud was, Walz had appointed kind of a fraud czar who was working on it. And it was my contention at the time that fraud was going to continue to get worse as this fraud czar focused on more investigations, more prosecutions. What has happened since that time is, because of the manner in which the federal government has approached immigration enforcement policy in this state, The U.S. Attorney's Office, which had been prosecuting the bulk of these prosecutions, has been gutted by people leaving who are frustrated with the government's approach on immigration and other things. And so I think what you and I are going to see is an attempt. There's a messaging attempt by Republicans, some on social media influencers who I am becoming more and more convinced are the greatest threat to democracy. Online political social media influencers pushing their BS narratives. But there are those who are saying that the only reason why there's these protests is to cover up on fraud that is going on. And that's what they're trying to distract to. And so I think Republicans are going to try to message on fraud to try to continue to have it be focused on that. But I'm going to tell you something. Nothing is going to nothing is going to take the light away from what is unfolding on the streets every day in this state with Operation Metro Surge and the interactions between the federal government and the Trump administration on ICE. It has drowned it out, and justifiably so. I think that's where the attention needs to be. We've had 2 citizens of this state that have been killed by the federal government related to ICE enforcement and an immigration policy. And so I think Republicans desperately want fraud to become what it was, but it's not just a messaging component anymore. It's not a matter about getting the media's attention. Again, the U.S. Attorney's Office has been gutted since this happened. And so the type of drip that I had raised a point about before, I'd said, look, we're going to, as the fraud czar, prior to this surge that we saw with Operation Metro Surge and this enforcement, I had said, look, there's going to be a drip. There's going to be more attention on it. It's going to be happening all through the next election cycle. That was predicated on the understanding that the U.S. Attorney's Office was going to be fully maintained, staffed, and there was going to be continual enforcement and prosecution of some of these matters. That dynamic has changed. And so Republicans have to recognize that this is another, I want to be sensitive always in discussing the political realities of this because lives have been lost. That's what we do on the show. We talk about the political realities, is that the Trump administration has done almost everything they can to make it harder for Republicans to win in this state.
Yes, I completely agree. We also this week saw I think it was just a week ago, maybe 2, we shared the recent inclusion of a new candidate for governor. Chris Madel joined the race for governor. He has now left the race for governor. He posted a 10-minute video, which is a good watch, saying that he could no longer support National Republicans' stated retribution on citizens of our state. He talked about how he originally supported the goals of ICE's operation in Minnesota, but the effort has expanded far beyond its stated focus on true public safety threats. He said United States citizens, particularly those of color, live in fear. United States citizens are carrying papers to prove their citizenship. That's wrong. I have to look my daughters in the eye and tell them I believe I did what was right, and that is what I'm doing today. And that's a big loss for a lot of folks, but it's clearly that this administration and their actions on this in our state was something he did not feel he could stand behind anymore. And so that is a big implication, a big change to the makeup of the Minnesota Republican candidate ticket. And again, it couldn't have been easy, but I applaud him for doing what he felt he needed to do for him, for his family, and for his beliefs. And it did shock me, though.
It did. And as somewhat of a homeless Republican, I identified a lot with what Madel said. It goes into a lot of the conversations. And I just want to point something out, and I think it leads into our next conversation a little bit about the legislature, is that I've had a number of conversations with people about how I understand, and I think we could be fair in saying that immigration enforcement was something that the Trump administration campaigned on. You and I have always discussed that there was a policy reality of how do you deport as many illegals as the government had claimed they were going to. And again, let's remember that Operation Metro Surge was about targeting the worst of the worst, which we've seen numerous examples of how that's not the case. And you and I had raised concerns about how this was going to be implemented. Again, and I also used the example of Mary Moriarty. She campaigned on a certain approach that she was going to have to the criminal justice system. And she was honest about how she was going to do that. And in office, I think the public, there was a truth in advertising related to Moriarty. How she campaigned is how she's led in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. But people have recoiled about that. And it's an example of where I think people didn't pay attention enough or understand the ramifications of what they were voting for. And in many ways, I think that's the same about Trump. It's very easy to put on a piece of paper that your policy is you're going to deport, you're going to clean up our immigration policy and deport people. But as you and as I think seasoned politicos and also realists understand that there was a practical matter that you and I have consistently said may come true was how are they going to do this? And I think what we have seen over the last month or so in this state has been an example of how the Trump administration can literally bungle, I think, an issue that helped deliver them the White House. Again, there has not been comprehensive immigration reform signed by a president since Ronald Reagan. And as we discussed in the last episode, you were born a couple years into his second term. And so as someone who remembers Reagan being in office, that's how long ago it was. And so it's an ongoing problem. And that has led to a lot of conversations I've had with Republicans, and very few of them have come out and said, this is good policy and good politics. And I did a Substack. I'm not going to get into it too much on this episode, but I did a Substack episode about a really frustrating conversation I had with Representative Walter Hudson about some things, and I'll link to the Substack in this episode. But I understand that not everyone is in a position to speak out in moments like this. And I understand that politics, as I wrote, isn't always performed at a microphone. But there are times when quiet conversations, back channel diplomacies, and behind the scenes shuttle efforts are not only appropriate but necessary. Real solutions require patience, discretion, and trust. The point I'm saying is that not everyone can speak up, and I want to believe that there are Republicans who maybe aren't as active on social media, maybe aren't as partisan in carrying the water for the Trump administration, who are working behind the scenes and engaging in that shuttle diplomacy that is needed to get this dialed back. I don't believe this happened in a vacuum, but simultaneously, I don't think it is incumbent. I don't think it is brave to try to go out there and try to claim that this is some moral issue that you're willing to lose an election on. Representative Hudson and I had conversations, and we discussed how he had felt that the Trump administration was penalizing the state, using Minnesota as a whipping boy. Really blunt language. And so I go back to a question which we're going to continue to dissect here is independent. First of all, I think there is a nexus between politics and policy. I believe that good policy can also be good politics. I also don't believe that politics is bad in this context, the reality of it. I do believe that there are things that warrant you standing up and, in essence, hurting your own political ambitions. I'm someone who stood up in 2024 and said, I'm going to be a Republican for Harris. And I got to assure you something. I took a lot of heat for that. That still continues to this day. What I don't consider brave is quietly whining and saying, this is really bad for Republicans and this is going to hurt us. And I don't agree with the policy, but then going out and claiming that you're some purist because you're willing to lose your election certificate because of a policy that in private is bad and is not good, but you're trying to go out and spin it the other way. Republicans, again, I believe in this state, in a month, have really faced an extinction level event. Like a comet is coming towards the earth and it's going to blow people out. And going along with this is when it's wrong. And let me just say something to you. There are people who believe, and you've identified them in the poll. I think 12% of Republicans think we haven't gone far enough. Great. Those 12% can reside in really, really red districts, and you and I could probably pick them out on the map. But those districts and those positions are not reflective of how Republicans are going to win statewide. And there is no one who I believe can credibly claim that the ability for Republicans to win in this state has gone up since the arrival of the United States government and Operation Metro Surge. And what frustrates me about that is I believe there is a way in which good policy can be enacted and it also be good politics. This, and I think it's the centrist position, the bipartisan position of good principled Republicans, independents, and Democrats is that the federal government has failed in their enforcement and vision for how they want to have their immigration policy on display and how they're going to enforce it in Minnesota. And who's going to be hurt by that are Republicans who run in November. And this is not a time, I think, for people to be quiet in the shadows and whisper their concerns while then going out there and trying to portray that they're principled, when in fact they're nothing more than cowards.
I think to that point, I think this is something that is at a scope and stage that I don't remember seeing something like this where across my social media, again, this is my Instagram accounts that I follow that are parenting accounts, that are decorating accounts, that are nothing political, never speak political at all. Over the past few days, I have seen at least a dozen of them come on and say, I know folks are asking me to speak up on this. And this is not, I try to keep this light. This is not what I do. But they have been urged and pushed into condemning what is going on and saying how horrific this is and making statements. This is more the breadth of what is going on and the conversations and the level at which it's in people, the forefront of people's brains and the top of their conversations, impacting all of our daily lives as far as what we see and the tragedy and I again, I'm not making this about me. Two tragic tragedies have occurred and lives have been lost, and the families and friends and their loved ones, their lives are forever altered. But this has got a level and a scope that I think might be being missed by some folks who just hear from other activists and just hear from, of folks who live and breathe this like we do, because it is everywhere. I mean, I think after the Renee Good shooting, it was 9 in 10 Americans had seen the video. That is just insane amount of coverage and folks that are seeing and hearing and living and breathing this like we are. And so I think there's something that it's just a different tightrope that folks are going to have to walk here as they're running for office. In particular, when we were looking at the Minnesota legislature, which I want to chat about briefly here, we know that there's that tightrope for the MAGA lane and walking that in general, especially in the swing districts in the suburbs here of folks that Republican candidates or electeds that are running for office again do have to navigate that. They have to come out with some sort of messaging of I support border security. I support legal immigration. I support deporting violent criminals, but we have to uphold our constitutional rights. We have to say that beating and point blank spraying chemical irritants and terrorizing communities is too far. That doesn't seem like it should be that difficult of a tightrope to walk, because I guess we've said that. I don't think that was a novel concept that we said, like, do I think we need to secure the border? Yes. Do I think that we need to make sure that people are coming into this country are doing so legally so that everybody who wants to come here for the American dream can come here, but go through the process to do so? Yes. Does that mean that the process needs to be fixed? Absolutely. Do we need to anybody who's committing crimes and being arrested for them and being let out on our streets? Totally inappropriate. We need to fix all of that. Do I think that going up to Black and brown individuals and saying, show me your papers, or going overhearing somebody who has an accent and saying, where are you from? Or boarding a school bus and asking children where they are born, do I think any of that is okay, acceptable, and should continue? Absolutely not. And I just think that it shouldn't be that hard. And Republicans need to figure out how to walk that line and say that message, because otherwise the trifecta is going to be done back tomorrow. And what happens in this state, who knows what that's going to look like. But call for a joint investigation, call for oversight and accountability and transparency, and Speak up. I know this is apples and oranges, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody gets pissed off that I make this tie here. But we spent a month plus talking about how Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan and their administration need to look inward. They need to root out the bad actors. They need to implement new processes. They need to fire people and hold them accountable. They need to look within themselves, within their Democrat commissioners, within their agency leads, within their own folks who are being poor stewards of what their role is. And we need to hold them accountable to do that. We've held Governor Walz's feet to the fire on all of that. Why does the same not turn when we look at Republicans? Why should we not demand that Trump and border control and ICE look inward and root out the bad actors and get different processes in place and hold people accountable and fire those who are bad? Get more training in there. I mean, these are things, I know it's apples and oranges. I know that 2 tragic lives have been lost under this ICE surge here in the state and not under fraud. I know it's not apples to apples. But the core principles of accountability and transparency and changing the system and making things better and increasing training so it doesn't happen again, how do Republicans not see that that is the exact same thing we need to focus over here? If you demand it there, don't you demand it here? I mean, this is where I've just been so incredibly frustrated. And I said I wasn't going to have a rant this episode, but there you go.
I want to talk about that. That's why we have a podcast. And they're not rants. You get to do that. It's your show. And don't say you don't get that editorial latitude to do it. That's the purpose you have the show. I think you're absolutely spot on. And I have pulled out my remaining hair having conversations with people about the absolute lack of decency. I've seen jackasses go out and say in the immediate afterwards, clean shoot. Republican influencers in Minnesota immediately jump in and say it's a clean shoot. People not asking questions. I saw Megyn Kelly go on her podcast and talk about how, she wants to feel sorry for Alex Pretti, but just can't do that. Who says those things? Who acts like a ghoul like that? She put out a tweet a couple days ago and said, the whistle should be banned. And someone responded and said, 1970 Megyn Kelly would have been leaning out the window, yelling for Paul Revere to shut the fuck up. It's a beautiful tweet. She's right. We are recording this on the 40th anniversary of the Challenger explosion, which I remember watching on TV. I was homesick that day, school in 6th grade. Reagan gave, and I'll tweet it out tonight, one of the most compassionate speeches about the loss of those astronauts. Do you know what Republicans would be saying today? You shouldn't go into space. You shouldn't try to touch the Sterling bonds and try to touch the face of God, as Reagan discussed. That's what they would say. They would blame it on, you flew too close to the sun. You shouldn't go into space. You shouldn't try to do the hard things. Republicans have gone out and found a way to lead on an issue in where they've just thrown out their compassion and decency. And again, you don't have to speak on stuff. If you really inside your head say, look, I can't feel sorry for Alex Pretti. You can't feel sorry for him. Okay. Why the fuck do you have to say it? Why do you have to go on a show and say that? You just can't fake it? You can't fake being a human. It's that important. It's politically advantageous to not show a heart, to not show that compassion. I don't understand where we lost being the compassionate conservative. There's nothing wrong. And I got to tell you something. I am so appreciative of what your expanded commentaries, which you would describe as rants, because when I sit back and listen, again, as you did, you are reinforcing, it's not just because you agree with me, but the depth in which you're showing how far this is broken through. Let's go back to this. They've lost Preya. Preya is as one of the best servers and butchers of red meat that we've ever had on this show. I mean, she is a butcher and she serves that red meat. They've lost Preya. And I don't agree with her all the time. But they have found a way to lose someone who has done who has in the last few years, in the last decade or so, has been on the front lines, going door to door, doing the work in this modern time that you and I did in the past. She is as hardcore as you can get as a true believer. But you want to know what she's not? She's not a robot. She's got a brain and she's got a heart. And she's going to use those and she's got a voice and she's going to use those and speak up when appropriate. And again, I applaud her for speaking up. And I can say that because I've applauded her for speaking up when I don't agree with her. But in this particular instance, she is brave and she should be applauded for that. But again, I go back to, you've lost Preya.
Right.
Can you think of, I mean, it's like losing John Rouleau, and he's been thoughtful in this, but they've lost Preya.
Yep.
And I get you can label us to some degree, and it may be easier for me because some of the candidates I've supported and the positions I've taken to just push me aside. But when you lost Preya, you think you have you might want to redial it in after you've lost Preya.
Well, and I think that is a larger point of the folks that are going to be impacted at the polls with this, right? I mean, we're talking a lot of younger voters. We're talking about suburban women. We are talking about those independents folks. And now we are potentially talking about Second Amendment gun owners, and the folks that can be a single issue voter that we
Yes.
see, who, especially in a midterm, could be maybe not bothered to show up to the polls. I know when we talk about Congress, which just in the remaining couple minutes, want to turn our attention there, that Trump is risking a lame duck end of his presidency here. If this trend of folks, of independents, of the polls not supporting him and what he is doing, if he continues down this path, Republicans in Congress obviously have a little bit of a different walk that they have to do, because you also are facing President Trump speaking out and either being in favor of your candidacy or not as you go forward, and whether you are challenged by a Trump Republican and as you run for Congress or not. Obviously, that is just a different layer that we're going to see, but they have to figure out if they're going to continue to defend what the president is doing on this, and risk alienating some of those moderates, or if they're going to criticize and maybe even just call for some more of that transparency and accountability, and potentially risk angering the Second Amendment base. Are they going to speak up on what the administration is saying about Second Amendment rights, which we know that they are trying to walk back? But is that going to have an impact on their district? Because let me tell you, when I worked on some of these congressional campaigns, especially when we talk about our delegate base, that is a big thing. We've got the religious right and we have got the gun right, and those are two big single party issues, sectors in our state, and I have to imagine that goes across the country as well. So I don't know. We don't know what's going to happen, how much this is going to be the number one topic as we move towards November. We are still 10 months away, but what I certainly think is that Democrats have a lot of ammo, a lot of opportunity in messaging to tie this to Trump, to tie these horrific tactics and these tragedies to all Republicans. And now to tie Republicans as being able to just throw our constitutional rights out the window, our right to due process and to peacefully assemble and to apparently carry guns. And so Republicans risk losing the House in 2026, and immigration, which was something that pulled really well for Republicans in the past, certainly is not doing so today.
No, and I agree. And I think Republicans have to start getting out more on this. I understand that Republicans want to show message discipline about fraud, but this state is hurting. This state is in pain. And you would know, working in Congress and working for a member of Congress, that as much as you want the issue to be about sometimes events change that require you to step up the mic and lead with a crisis and lead with that. I have been frustrated by what I would consider to be the 12%, which we've identified here, the 12% that think that ICE hasn't gone far enough, being the loudest voice on this, and not the thoughtful conservatives, the compassionate conservatives who understand that the state is hurting and it's grieving and it's traumatized. I've given a number of interviews talking about I'm concerned about when the waters recede, what is left of this state. And Republicans have to start, I think, showing that they want to lead the whole state.
Mhm.
And I think that needs to happen more. I have seen Senator Klobuchar, Senator Smith, Congresswoman Craig, Congresswoman McCollum, Congresswoman Morrison, Governor Walz, the Attorney General on national television to the point that I thought it was TPT and Almanac, the frequency in which I saw them. And I keep, again, pulling my hair and saying, where is the thoughtful conservative Republican message? Where is the message there? Because again, I go back and think about what would, if the 35W bridge collapsed right now, what would be the response? If the Challenger explosion happened today, would social media be dominated by people who said, well, you shouldn't have been driving at that time and you shouldn't try to go into space? And that's what we really need to get into, is why were so many people on the road that time? And why is the government sending people into space? That's where I worry that Republicans are going to be in this situation, is that they, for some reason, can't be human. And what you've highlighted in your expanded commentaries over the last few episodes is how I think this has broken through to more Minnesotans than I think the people that are the keyboard warriors note.
Mhm.
I'll also say, since our last episode, I think it's up close to 50,000 people, Becky. 50,000 people participated in a protest, a parade, a show of support for ICE leaving the state. I want to point out something. I don't think there was one police call, one incident of crime that occurred during that. And I got to tell you something. I cannot think of the last time that conservatives or the center right in this state had any type of outpouring of support in that type of way, in support of or in opposition to anything. The closest that I can think to is when Operation Enduring Freedom and supporting the troops that occurred in the aftermath of 9/11, that was going on, and that type of rally around the flag atmosphere that we had in this country. I haven't seen anything like that. And I think that a close to 50,000 Minnesotans showing up when it was, schools were closed in large part because of freezing cold temperatures, and they showed up. My goodness, I can tell you where the hearts and minds are right now, the people in this state, and it's not with the 12% who think ICE hasn't gone far enough.
I certainly agree. I think that kind of wraps up where things stand, what we know as we know it, with Homan being here, with conversations between President Trump, Governor Walz, Mayor Fry, and others. I want to remain hopeful that some negotiation is going on and some solution and collaboration is going to be had. I'm going to send out all of my good thoughts and well wishes and prayers and vibes and whatever you want to call them. And I encourage everybody to join, that we do not see any more horrific, tragic incidents in our state or elsewhere due to these efforts. And next week, we will be back. We will chat with what we know of these conversations. We will start, hopefully, turning our attention more towards 2026, talking about caucus, talking about potentially Senator Amy Klobuchar joining the race for governor, if that's still continuing to happen, and more. So we will continue to cover this, and just hoping that it's a little bit more even keeled and with some hopefully forward progress towards that light at the end of the tunnel.
Very well said, and thank you. And I want to give a shout out to the peacemakers. I have been praying more these days, and a little shout out to one of my favorite Bible verses, which is, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the chosen of God." I want to appeal to our peacemakers and to our better angels right now, and hope that this can get solved. But I want to thank you, Becky, so much for, again, showing so much compassion and strong opinion, and just being a good person again on this podcast. Okay.
Right back at you.
I want to thank all our listeners for joining us for another episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website and across all social media platforms at BB BreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be back next week. Stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.